Since the beginning of the day, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has already counted 132 Russian assaults on the front. Fighting took place in 12 directions. Most often, the enemy tried to break through the Ukrainian defenses in the Pokrovsk sector of the front. Where else has there been an increase in Russian assaults, and what are the results of the Dobropillia counteroffensive? Find out in our next report.
Ukrainian artillerymen destroyed a genuine Russian military relic. In the Donetsk region, during counter-battery operations, Ukrainian forces detected and destroyed a Soviet ML-20 howitzer, a gun that was produced before and during World War II. And Ukrainian pilot border guards are sharing footage of the precise work of FPV drones and Vampire UAVs. In one of the directions, they eliminated 50 Russian occupiers and also turned 2 armored vehicles, 2 military trucks, and a couple of Russian motorcycles into scrap metal. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has recorded 132 combat engagements along the entire front line since the beginning of the day. Defense forces repelled 16 Russian attacks in the southern Slobozansky direction. Another 10 unsuccessful enemy assaults were recorded in the Konstantinovka sector of the front. And in the Lyman sector, the Russian army made 9 unsuccessful attempts to break through the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians did not attempt any assaults today, only in the Hulyai-Pol direction. The most intense fighting is taking place in the Pokrovsk direction, the Ukrainian General Staff noted. In this sector of the front, Russian forces tried 43 times to push Ukrainian defenders from their positions. Military analysts say that in the near future, the Russians are unlikely to slow the pace of their assaults in this direction.
Time is running out. It's already October, and we can see that the rains have started. Well, that is, the weather is changing, and the way combat operations are conducted in autumn and winter is significantly different from the conditions possible in late spring or during the summer. Therefore, the enemy will obviously try to take advantage of any warm days that are left before winter sets in order to complete their attempts to encircle the Pokrovsk-Yelisavetgrad agglomeration.
Meanwhile, the defense forces continue the Dobropol counteroffensive operation. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky. He visited the positions and spoke with the commanders. According to the Commander-in-Chief, the AFU are detecting and eliminating saboteurs, as well as groups of Russian occupiers who have found themselves encircled. In total, 188 square kilometers of Donbass territory have been liberated during the operation. Almost 213 square kilometers have been cleared of saboteurs. I have identified the problematic issues and needs of our offensive group and have given the necessary instructions. Counter-sabotage measures will continue. The defense will remain active. Measures are also being taken to prevent the enemy from advancing in the Pokrovsk direction, to improve logistics, and to protect roads and critical infrastructure. Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Telegram. 1,020 Russian servicemen were eliminated by Ukraine's defense forces over the past day. Thus, the total losses of the Russian army have exceeded 1,119,000 people, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. According to Ukrainian military sources, over the past day they destroyed 1 Russian tank and an armored combat vehicle, as well as 15 artillery systems and 55 units of Russian automotive equipment. Ukraine's defense forces struck a Lukoil gas processing facility in Russia. This information was confirmed by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Drones attacked the Korobkovsky plant in the Volgograd region. A large fire broke out at the site of the strike. The flames could be seen from afar, according to local social media and eyewitnesses. The facility is considered the largest gas processor in the southern federal district of Russia. Its production capacity is 450 million cubic meters of raw material per year. The defense forces also struck another important fuel infrastructure facility, the Yefimivka linear production and dispatch station in the Volgograd region. The station services several main pipelines for transporting oil and petroleum products in the region. Its throughput capacity is 50 million tons per year. Explosions and fires were reported at both facilities. Information about the consequences of the strike is being clarified. From a statement by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Telegram, members of the European Parliament are convinced that restrictions on Ukraine's use of weapons provided by Western partners for strikes on military targets within the territory of the Russian Federation should be lifted. This is stated in the resolution adopted today. 469 MEPs voted in favor of the document. In addition, the parliamentarians called on the EU to begin using Russia's frozen assets to help Ukraine as soon as possible. The European Parliament also called on EU member states in its resolution to shoot down aerial targets that illegally violate their borders.
The document states that the European Parliament supports any initiatives that would allow for coordinated decisions in response to provocations in EU airspace, including the destruction of aerial targets.
The scale of Russia's subversive and hybrid activities against the EU is equivalent to state terrorism, even if they do not reach the level of an armed attack. The EU must demonstrate resolve and make it clear that any third country attempting to violate the sovereignty of a member state will immediately face retaliatory measures. From the resolution of the European Parliament.
Ukrainian soldiers carried out a daring operation to rescue civilians from a frontline village. The 3rd Mechanized Battalion released footage of the evacuation of an elderly woman and her grandson in Novorihorivka, Donetsk region. In this settlement, it is impossible to use vehicles due to attacks by Russian drones. They decided to evacuate the civilians during the day. They walked for an hour and a half across open terrain, guided by a Ukrainian drone. The evacuation was successful. The civilians are now in a safe place and the Ukrainian Armed Forces soldiers were unharmed. Keir Starmer and Narendra Modi discussed the rejection of Russian oil and Russia's war against Ukraine. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is currently on a 2-day visit to India. The heads of government met in Mumbai. They discussed stability in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as the need for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Modi, who calls himself a friend of Putin, emphasized that he wants the war to end through dialogue and diplomacy. In turn, Starmer called on India, which is still one of the buyers of oil from the aggressor country, to give up Russian energy resources.
As for the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine, we discussed it and especially the outcome that we both want to achieve. I would like to note that both Prime Minister Modi and I emphasized the need to end this war. We also discussed the steps that can be taken to achieve this goal. We had a broad discussion. In addition, we also raised important topics of cooperation in several critical areas such as energy security, thoroughly discussed the sanctions against the Shadow Fleet and the ongoing work of the Coalition of the Willing Nations.
In order to continue financing the war against Ukraine, the Kremlin will raise taxes for people and businesses. This was reported by the Center for Countering Disinformation. Moscow is focused solely on military spending at the expense of social programs, so the tax increase will affect everyone. And although the Kremlin leadership insists that military objectives will soon be achieved, in reality the Russian army has not made significant gains on the battlefield and is rapidly losing personnel. More details can be found in the report by my colleagues.
The Russian army is advancing in the Zaporizhia direction and is also continuing massive strikes, allegedly targeting Ukraine's military facilities. This was stated during his report to Putin on October 7th by the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Gerasimov. In response, the head of the Kremlin said that the decisions made in February 2022 to launch Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine were correct and timely, and that the goals of the so-called special military operation would be achieved. However, experts note that these statements have nothing to do with reality.
For the aggressor, probably one of the key problems is that there are no significant changes on the front line. The fact is that the so-called special military operation is at a dead end. The economic situation in Russia has become significantly more complicated, to put it mildly. I mean, including the oil refining system, the growing dependence on Chinese resources, and so on and so forth.
Stagnation or already a recession. Even according to the most optimistic forecasts by economists, Russia's economic growth rate in 2025 will not exceed 1%. In 8 months, the Russian budget deficit has already reached almost 2% of the annual GDP, and by the end of the year it will rise to 2.6%. So where does Putin plan to get the money to continue the war? From the pockets of citizens? A new wave of tax increases is being launched in Russia. Thus, in 2026, the authorities plan to collect almost 2.5 trillion rubles more from the population and businesses. The main source of revenue is raising the VAT rate from 20 to 22%, which will lead to higher prices.
This indicates that Russia is running out of resources to finance its war of aggression against Ukraine. That's why the regime is trying to shift this burden onto citizens and businesses. Next year, the army and security forces will consume about 40% of the budget. Since the war remains a priority for the Kremlin, these expenditures stay at a high level. At the same time, social programs are being cut, and the tax burden on the population is increasing. The Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on Telegram.
Putin's goal is to wage war against Ukraine at any cost. It doesn't matter if he has to completely rob his own people or send thousands of Russians to certain death at the front.
We state that Russian troops have been ordered to storm our positions at any cost. Accordingly, the level of Russian losses has increased significantly. Just our SBU fighters alone, and only in the Pokrovsk direction, are now eliminating more than 100 Russian occupiers per day. And that's not counting the results of the actions of fighters from other components of our defense and security forces. In total, over the past month, the fighters of the SBU Special Operations Center A have eliminated 3,028 Russian occupiers. Each of these has been properly verified. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Russian propaganda will now pay special attention to shaping the proper military political mindset among the personnel. Russian soldiers, both conscripts and contract servicemen, will be told about so-called heroic deeds of participants in the war against Ukraine. In addition, Russian servicemen will be forced to study Putin's annual address to the Federal Assembly, according to the publication Verstka.
According to the plan, 10 hours are allocated for lectures about these heroic deeds. These lectures will be given every month throughout the year. In addition, soldiers will have to attend the traditional lecture, Extremism, Terrorism, and Neo-Nazism as a security threat, to which Russophobia has also been added for next year, according to the publication Verstka.
Putin's desire to militarize Russia as much as possible could turn into a disaster for him. The Kremlin fears that the return of tens of thousands of soldiers and former convicts from the front will trigger a surge in crime and social destabilization. The situation is already being compared to the 1990s, when former participants of the Afghan war formed gangs and mafia groups, according to the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service. Since 2023, military courts have received nearly 1,000 cases under articles related to murder and intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm resulting in death. And the number of convictions for such crimes has risen sharply. If in 2022 there were 38 such cases, then in the current period of 2025, Russian courts have considered 377 new cases. Yulia Granovskaya for Freedom TV channel.
During a meeting with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, Russian dictator Putin essentially admitted that the Azal passenger plane was shot down by Russian air defense missiles, but ultimately blamed Ukraine. He claimed that on the day of the tragedy, Russia was allegedly tracking 3 Ukrainian drones that had crossed the border of the Russian Federation. Let me remind you, the Azerbaijani Airlines passenger plane crashed in Kazakhstan on December 25, 2024. It was on a flight from Baku to Grozny but was denied landing, allegedly due to air defense operations. The pilots of the heavily damaged airliner decided to fly over the Caspian Sea to Kazakhstan, but were unable to land the plane, crashing during their third attempt to land. There were 67 people on board, including crew members. As a result of the crash, 38 people died. Sanctions in action. Russian airlines are preparing for the loss of hundreds of civilian airplanes and helicopters. This was stated by the Federal Air Transport Agency. If 2 years ago there were more than 2,000 aircraft in the country, now only half as many are still flying. Import substitution in aviation has also failed. The Sukhoi Superjet 100 airliner still depends on foreign components, and the project for its full localization keeps getting postponed. Larissa Petruk will provide the details.
Sanctions and international isolation are grounding Russian civil aviation. In the coming years, companies may lose hundreds of foreign aircraft. Due to problems with repairs and the inability to purchase original parts, 58 aircraft have gone out of service recently. And this is just the beginning, they admit at Rostec. At least 200 of the remaining Western airliners with carriers which have been cut off from repairs and spare parts due to sanctions will have to be taken out of service by 2030 and replaced with domestic ones. According to the head of Rostec, nearly 30% of the Western civil airliner fleet is at risk of being grounded in the next 5 years. This fleet consists of about 700 Boeing and Airbus aircraft, which account for 90% of passenger air transportation in Russia, writes the Moscow Times on Telegram. Replacing these aircraft with domestic ones is no less of a challenge. The service life of Soviet-era planes is coming to an end. It is becoming increasingly difficult to create new fleets due to disrupted supply chains for components, and the high central bank interest rate is holding back investment, writes Reuters. Thus, as of August, since the beginning of 2025, Russian aircraft manufacturers have delivered only 1 out of 15 planned commercial aircraft.
Mainly aircraft will be withdrawn from this fleet. These are old Soviet aircraft, planes built back in Soviet times, such as the An-24, An-26, Yak-40. The problem is not that they are being withdrawn. That's actually a good thing, because old planes that have reached the end of their service life, hopefully they won't extend it any further, will finally be retired, and that stewardess will finally be laid to rest. But what will replace them? So the plan was that we would quickly organize everything in 3 days, and then everyone would want to be friends with us again, and somehow everything would work itself out. Because purchases were being made, but now, to be honest, there's nothing to replace them with.
The agency's publication reports that the number of fatalities in commercial aviation crashes in Russia since the beginning of 2025 has exceeded the total number of victims from such incidents over the previous 2 years combined. According to statistics from Rostransnadzor, in just part of 2025, 53 people have already died in 4 crashes. For comparison, in 2024 there were 17 aviation incidents, with 37 fatalities. In response to the growing risks, the Federation's aviation authorities have planned inspections of regional air carriers. During these inspections, officials are to determine the level of flight safety, the maintenance of aircraft airworthiness, and the training of specialists. The reason for these inspections was the crash of an Angara Airlines An-24 in July and the risk of a similar disaster happening again. According to Rostransnadzor, the number of aviation incidents in 2024 rose to 17, compared to 8 in 2023, and the number of fatalities increased to 37 from 12, reports the Moscow Times. The Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service reports that Russian airlines are increasingly resorting to cannibalization, transferring working parts from one aircraft to another in order to somehow maintain their fleets. For example, the companies Volga-Dnipro and Aeroflot recently reached an agreement to transfer the last 8 Boeing aircraft. These aircraft will serve as donors for spare parts. At the beginning of 2022, Russia had approximately 1,500 to 1,800 Western-made civilian aircraft in operation. Today, that number has decreased several times over. The contract between the airlines Volga-Dnipro and Aeroflot is the first case in the Russian aviation market where a passenger airline acquires cargo aircraft solely for the purpose of dismantling them for parts. In the medium term, this will lead to a reduction in the aircraft fleet, an increase in transportation costs, and further degradation of Russian civil aviation. If the current conditions persist, by 2026 Russia's aircraft fleet could be reduced by more than half. From a statement on the website of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Let me remind you, about a year ago, Putin said that Russia needed to build its own airplanes and publicly gave corresponding instructions to state companies. He was referring to the passenger version of the light multipurpose Baikal aircraft. However, not a single aircraft has been put into operation so far. Larissa Petruk for Freedom TV channel.